It's great to see people turning out again. Thank God this is, well, I know COVID's not over, but thank goodness we can relax a bit and do these again. They've stopped for nearly 2 years, didn't they? Not just here, but at Five Leaves, all over. So thank you for coming. I'm John Holmes, and my book's over there. This is the BBC Home Service. What a natty title. Youngsters won't know what it means, but older people will. And that's about 50 years in the BBC. That's enough of that. I'm not here to plug my book. Well, not quite. I'm going to introduce you to a fascinating array of local authors. I mean, it really is fascinating. They come from, when you hear what they've done, they've all come from different backgrounds, and they've got into the system in a different way. Because it's not easy to get. Anybody here try to get published? Sitting in the audience. Well, I won't use any expletives, but it's very hard. So it's quite an uphill struggle. So let me introduce you to the people. Now, to the authors. When I was at school, they always used to say you do it in alphabetical order, not to show any preference, which was great for Mr. Abel, but when it got down to Mr. Williams, it wasn't quite so good. But then that goes through the whole of your life, doesn't it? We don't show any favour. Do it in alphabetical order. So, without any regard for order, Elizabeth Chadwick, let's start with. Writes historical fiction. The Wild Hunt was her first big success, and on the strength of the first three... You can hear me all right, can you? Yeah, good. Yeah, on the strength of the first three chapters and synopsis, she was taken on by the publishers Michael Joseph, which is, of course, part of Penguin. They took her to Groucho's for lunch. I say. That costs a fortune to get in there. And said they adored her love scenes. Yes, grinned her husband. I'm the research assistant. She was then hired by Columbia Pictures to turn the film script of First Night into a novel. First Night starred Sean Connery and Richard Gere. Did you meet them?
Afraid not.
Oh.
They finished filming when I went to Pinewood.
Oh, gosh. Her book, The Champion, was shortlisted as the best romantic novel of the year, and she won the award of Best Work of Historical Fiction for Defy a King in 2011. Waterstones selected A Place Beyond Courage as one of their best books in historical fiction. Elizabeth Chadwick. Ian Charles Douglas. Ian writes for children and adults. He's author of award-winning series of the Zeke Haley books. It's by all means hold them up when you just mention Zeke Haley books. This sci-fi series is set on Mars and includes psychic teenagers, monsters, and the odd Martian ghost. A bit like West Bridgeford, really. His non-fiction book, A Children's History of Nottinghamshire, became a local bestseller. I think that's great you've done something like that. He's an active member of the Nottingham Writers' Studio, a regular guest on Notts TV, and he reviews theatre productions for Left Line. We'll hear more from Charles later. Claire Harvey said she was a bookworm as a child, but did not come to writing until in her 30s. This was when she was an army wife, whilst her husband was away in a war zone. As a result, she has travelled the world. She is acclaimed author of 4 historical World War II novels. She enjoys mentoring, workshops in Derby and Nottingham. So you're not travelling around the world now?
No. Just travelling around my kitchen, really.
T.M. Logan, can I call you Tim?
Yes.
Yes. Tim Logan.
Timothy, or whatever you want.
Sid was a reporter for 5 years at the Nottingham Post, then moved on to Daily Mail. You must know Jeremy.
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Jeremy.
There is Jeremy Lewis. One of the best feature writers from the Post in years, Jeremy Lewis. Anyway, he was a reporter for the Nottingham Post, then moved on to Daily Mail and became the paper's science reporter. But it didn't leave him much time to take up his real passion, which was, of course, thriller writing. So he moved back here to the University of Nottingham as a deputy director in charge of communications. This gave him the time to write lies. Sounds like a press officer, doesn't it? But actually, Lies is the title of his book. It was become Amazon's biggest e-book of 2017. That's quite an accolade, isn't it? Then came The Holiday, chosen as Richard and Judy book club pick. Does that turn into TV?
It did, yeah. It was on in March this year, and it's still on Netflix now if you want to watch it.
And what do I follow this up? Yes, it was turned. I'm moving on now to Wilf Morgan. Wilf Morgan. Okay, this is Wilf. Wilf is one of our up-and-coming bright lights in Nottinghamshire as an author. He grew up in Bestwood. He's one of the new writing talents in Nottingham's literary scene. He is author of The Cotton Keeper, Lost Angels, and The Assassin's Wedding. In Left Line, they asked if you'd actually researched the assassins very closely.
Yeah, especially as some of it was kind of based around my own wedding experience, but there were no assassins that I know of present.
Any here? No, all right then. And he self-publishes 88 tales. So even in publishing, we've got quite across the board. You're self-publishing, we've got you. A remarkable success story. So, Elizabeth, your love of acting goes back to Scottish history?
Yeah, my love of acting.
Yeah, it goes back to loving acting out dramatic pieces.
Not really.
It says here, she loves going back to acting out dramatic pieces of Scots history in a village just outside Glasgow and galloping about on pretend horses.
Well, that was just in the classroom. We got a very enlightened teacher where the history lessons back in the 60s used to be written on the blackboard, and us pupils had to copy it all down. Whereas she would do the bit of the writing on the blackboard, you'd copy it down, and then out would come the dressing up box, and she would reinforce what we'd just been having to write down by choosing children from the class to dress up from a little dressing up box she got and act out the scenes that we'd just been having to write about on the blackboard. So I enjoyed doing that tremendously. We were doing Scottish medieval at that time. And I thought, wow, the medieval period's really interesting because we get to do these little scenes, and it was such fun. And then the following year, the teacher didn't have a dressing up box and this approach to teaching, and it was back to the blackboard, and we'd moved on from medieval. So I'm sure that was the germ of what gave me the idea that medieval history was actually more exciting than other periods.
And you really have explored it quite deeply, haven't you?
I had to think, I've been asked this before, so I've had to think through why. People say, why medieval? And I've had to think through the different pointers. So the first one was that Scottish history. The second one was becoming a teenager and lusting after first Keith Michel, and then in The Six Wives of Henry VIII, and then going back to a BBC programme called Desert Crusader, where I really quite fell for the hero. And there were no videos back in those days. You couldn't rewind and watch it and have your drool moment. No. So I actually started writing it down. I'd always told myself stories, but age 15 was the first time I began writing, and it was just coincidence that I'd rather fallen for this medieval chap and wanted the history to feel as true as possible, so I began researching. The more I researched, the more interested I became, the more I wanted to write it. So it's all interconnected, and it's how I've worked out how my interest came about.
Lovely era. Did you ever get to meet Keith Michel?
No.
You don't have much luck, do you? You missed out on Sean Connery.
I've not met many actors now. No, I mean, I've met Terry Pratchett and various ones, so that's great compensation.
I think that's a nice one. Ian, writes for children and adults. Why did you write for children and adults?
Well, not at the same time. Sorry. Why do I write for children?
Yeah.
Well,
it's not the easiest area to write.
No, I mean, people sometimes think that, it must be easy writing for children than for adults. I say, no, actually, it's the reverse. It's harder writing for children than it is to adults. And why I do it, I think because it gives me an opportunity to escape from this sometimes depressing world that we live in, and to go on wonderful fantasy trips in my imagination, and to sort of try and rekindle that nostalgia and love of books that I had when I was growing up, and that got me through some tough times in my childhood, which I hope I can then share with younger children coming up, next generations coming up.
Do you want to say more about the tough times or not?
Well, we all had our hard times growing up, didn't we? I grew up with a mentally ill mother and my very strict father, and I was very unpopular at school.
You were?
Yes, I was, yes.
We like him now, don't we?
Well, I was overweight, and I didn't understand anything about football, and quite scholarly, so that made me quite unpopular. But then I came to this wonderful city, of course, and went to Nottingham University and made loads of friends. And then I was Mr. Popular then. It went to my head a little bit. So that's why.
Well, we've had medieval history. Why did you go into sci-fi?
Well, I think for me, science fiction asks some of the big questions about that we're all facing today. You know, what is it to be human? Where are humanity going? Where is the environment going? Where is the universe going? And it also aspires us to a better future. You know, of course, we write about dystopias because, you know, fiction is conflict, but those dystopias lead on to utopias where, you know, disease has been conquered, where people live long, happy, healthy lives, where, you know, all the violence that we see around us today is a memory. So, you know, it's asks the big questions, and it's guiding us towards a better future.
And you won quite a few awards as well. I mean, you guest at the Malta's 2019
Yes, I
Festival of
did.
Literary
Yeah, it
Stars.
was. Yeah, that was lovely.
How did that come about?
Well, they contacted me.
Fair enough. Yeah.
People always contacted me. Usually people contact me asking me to help them for free. They don't get very far. But sometimes people come offering me work. And they just asked me, they flew me out there for there was like an educational thing going on there. They wanted to celebrate all these kids from across the island of Malta that had done really well. So they organised this weekend for them. And they were absolutely lovely and really, you know, well behaved, and really threw themselves into my workshops with gusto. And you know, and it was just, and I'd never been to Malta before or since, but it's absolutely beautiful. We were in they got that fantastic harbour there. We were in the Maritime Museum with all that around us. So it was lovely.
And a Gravity Award, only recently, really, wasn't it? Last year.
Yes, that was for one of my adult short stories. Yes, that was about somebody called Lewis. I'm having a bit of a brain moment now. Charles Dodson, Lewis Carroll.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and how an unknown time in his life when he was in an asylum out in the countryside, and he thinks his imagination is escaping from him, and maybe it is. So it follows the story of this radical older doctor that is sent from London to try and cure him, who has to solve all these riddles to get inside Lewis Carroll's head.
And a travel guide as well. You won an award for that.
Yeah, well, because I am fortunate enough to have travelled a little bit, you know, and I lived in the Far East for 11, 12 years, that now and again I dust off my memories from those days, and I don't do it much, but it's been quite successful, that what I have done. So, you know, I'm hoping to do more in the future.
Right.
Thank you.
Someone who's travelled is Claire Harvey. Do you draw on that for your books?
I have done, yeah, and in fact the book that's out on submission at the moment is set partly in post-war Zanzibar and also Zanzibar in the 19th century. And I had, I think, 3 weeks in Zanzibar, so drew from my very hazy memories from travelling, you know, in early adulthood. But yeah, it's always, stuff always bubbles up, don't you? And you don't always know where it comes from, but it might be from somewhere you've lived or something you've experienced, and you don't always realise until afterwards. It's like you were saying about people ask you a question and then you sort of track back and go, oh, that's where that came from, because I fancied so-and-so. I love the fact that your book started off as fan fiction.
Who did you fancy that inspired you then?
Who did I fancy that inspired me? Oh, I can't think.
Well, why
I didn't deliberately go into writing, you know, I suppose my books were categorised as romantic because there is always a romantic element, but I was really writing more about the women than the men. But yeah, obviously, you want a beefcake in there somewhere, but I didn't have a character in mind.
When you're writing, you don't think of this person.
Well, like a Diet Coke man.
I thought you might think of your
not
husband,
specifically. Oh, yes.
So, historical World War II novels.
Yes, yeah. So
What made you light on that?
Well, it started off, I was actually at Nottingham University. I've just realised I was there when you were working there. Okay. And I was doing a master's in creative writing, and I just started. And it was around about this time of year, and at that time my husband was still in the army. We were living on Chetwynd Barracks, and he was polishing up his medals, ready for the ceremony, bulling his boots and doing all of that, because obviously Sunday they have to do a big parade. And I made a joke, because his father had been in the army, and I said, oh, I bet you've got more medals than your dad by now. Not a very funny joke, a comment. And he said, oh, the weird thing is, you know, Mum saw more enemy action than Dad ever did. And I was like, your mum? What are you talking about? And he said, yeah, she served in World War II. I was like, what? And his mum had passed away long before we got together, so I'd never met her. But she served on the anti-aircraft guns in World War II. And that was a revelation to me because I'd grown up in the 1970s with all these, war films like The Great Escape, and I'd only ever thought that, war was very male preserved.
Yeah,
And it hadn't occurred to me that women were soldiers in World War II. And I thought, this is really interesting. And so I said, are there any family members on her side that I could talk to about this, because maybe I could use this in my fiction. And he said, oh, no, she didn't have any family. And I said, again, I was like, what do you mean she didn't have any family? She said, no, she didn't have any family. And I said, can you tell me more? He said, well, no, there just aren't any relatives on that side. And at the time, his father was living in Tenerife with his stepmother, so I didn't want to talk to them about it. And I thought, well, it doesn't matter because it's fiction. So I wrote a book about a girl soldier in World War II who, for whatever reason, didn't have any family, and then that became my debut novel. So that was how I ended up just falling into writing about World War II because of the family connection.
And does that continue in your latest book?
Yeah, the one this isn't my latest, this is only the third one, but yes, World War II has been a theme. Yeah. I just think it's really interesting because it was a time when women did get more interesting roles and did it's an exciting period to write about anyway, but from a woman's perspective, I know there was a lot going on in earlier time periods too, but it was just more in evidence in society at that. I think there was a bit of a seismic shift.
Yes, women didn't have a bit of raw deal in medieval times, didn't they?
Yeah.
They're very
Yes,
powerful.
there was a lot of hidden things going on. I mean, I've written several novels about women, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Yes.
And
yes, you have. Oops,
they just have to deal as best they could within the rules and sometimes without the rules. And it's interesting digging to find out what they could and couldn't do and how they managed to turn things on their head sometimes.
Tim.
Yes.
Right, so I'm doing in alphabetical order, just in case you hadn't noticed. It's easier, so apologies, Wilf. Morgan should be all right, should be up there, shouldn't he? No,
We're in the middle. If you go by the first name, then it's all bottom.
yeah, should have done that. Oh, yeah. You're a reporter for 5 years at the Nottingham Post.
Yes, yeah.
Doing what?
Well, I started off as a trainee, as a kind of just learning the craft a little bit, and then I did a bit of everything, a bit of court and all kinds of stuff. And then for the last 2 years, I was the education correspondent, so doing schools mostly and universities and that sort of thing. So, and then I thought, well, London's there, all the nationals are there, and I should probably go and give that a go. So, I did that for the 3 years, and then. As you said earlier, I realised that if I stayed there, I was probably never going to actually do the other thing, which was writing fiction, and I kind of had that in my head for a long time, and it had never actually started to, never actually got anywhere. And it sort of dawned on me that to actually write a book, I'd need to actually write a book, so to actually sit down every day and write. So that's where it started from.
But it's one thing to sit down. I mean, look, many people here have thought, I'll sit down and write a book. Yeah, well, okay, yeah. So you open to the first page. What do you write about?
Well, I mean, the first book I wrote didn't get published, so I spent a long time, probably about 6-7 years, on a book which still to this day is unpublished. So it was kind of like a learning process, and I did learn a lot through that, and I managed to get an agent as well in that process, and she taught me lots of things, which I then put into the next one. But really, from the beginning, I was just thinking, well, can I do this? Is it possible? Could you, if you spent an hour a day, would you end up, do you end up eventually with a book length story, which obviously you do, and then kind of just trying to go from there really, and not giving up, which I think is kind of one of the most difficult things. Just
everybody's nodding at that.
Yeah, not to give up.
You get to a point where you just get like is it a block or?
Well, I just think when that first book was knocked back, I just thought, well, I said to my agent, well, what do I do now? And she said, well, write another one if you can. And after sort of running around the house and ranting and raving a bit, I did then sort of sit down and start to think about what I would do next. So, and that was the book that then did get published. So
Lies.
Lies.
So what was the inspiration of Lies?
It was just a kind of one of those sort of random. A lot of my books come from sort of fairly random ideas or things that happened. So my wife used to have a blue Fiesta, which is quite a common colour. And someone else on our street had the same car, basically. And I think I saw it one day in traffic, and I was thinking, well, what the hell? What's Sally doing here? What's she doing here? And then, obviously, a few seconds later, I realised that it wasn't her.
See, yes.
It was this other person who kind of was, driving around the neighbourhood as well. But that was then the sort of one of the sparks for the beginning of the story, which is, the guy's driving in traffic and he sees a car which does turn out to be his wife. She's in a strange part of London. He follows her, and turns out she's up to no good, kind of thing. So, but yeah, that was quite a few of my stories do have those kind of little bits of personal experience in, and. Not the murders, obviously, but the kind of the beginnings at least.
So that became Amazon's biggest e-book of 2017.
Yeah, which was a massive surprise.
Oh,
and it's
exciting.
It was a sort of one of those things which, for whatever reason, and there's lots of luck involved in these things, and you get some sort of reader feedback, and you get some traction on Amazon, and it's sort of no one can predict that kind of thing. And I think it's really hard to. Unless you're Richard Osman, then I think probably you can predict it. But it was just kind of amazing. And I was just when it came out had also kind of been made redundant at the university as well. So that was separated by 2 weeks. Those two things. So it was kind of weird timing. But.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah. And then The Holiday comes along, which you wrote in how long?
Well, there was another book, it was 29 Seconds, which
yeah.
came out in the following year, and then The Holiday was 2019. And that was, again, a kind of a very weird to get when you get the call about the Richard and Judy book club, and it's a very kind of strange cloak and dagger kind of thing. And
Is it? Tell us about, because I've never had a call.
Because my publisher says, well, they rang me up, my editor, and said, I'm not going to email you because we can't, because you might forward it on to someone, or the secret might be out. But this is happening, and we're pushing back the publication date to tally with their summer book club announcement, and you can't tell anyone, because if you tell anyone, then they might change their minds. So you can't even tell your wife. So obviously I did tell my wife, but and you can't tell. But I told a handful of people. But for everybody else, I was just saying to them, well, I don't know why they've pushed the publication date back. It's just they've just changed their minds. So, but yeah, it was very, very surreal, really. And then when it came out, obviously has a massive boost from Richard and Judy. So although Richard thought I was a female author when we met. Until we met, and then
Oh, thank goodness for that.
So the initials obviously are kind of so that people don't. If people say, well, I only read female authors, then they're not sort of put off by Tim or Timothy. So hence TM. It's Timothy Michael, so they are real.
Not like Will I Am or anything.
No.
Right. But then you've had the excitement of this Richard and Judy, and then you get someone just phone. How does that work? I mean, I've never had anything. Television phone me up and ask them to do anything.
Well, that's sort of handled by my agent, so they'll put
Who's
it.
your agent? Sound they good?
It's a company called Darley Anderson in London.
Oh, yeah.
But they just sort of pitch it out to different production companies, and a few of them said they were interested, and then what you get told is that lots of books get optioned, lots of books get interest, but hardly any of them ever get made because there's lots of hurdles to jump. And so I didn't have any expectation that it would be made, and then it all happened during lockdown, so that was even more weird and kind of against the grain. But it was greenlit in lockdown and filmed in Malta. Weird connection there. During lockdown last year. So it was.
What do you think of the actors who played the parts?
Yeah, I thought they were. I mean, Jill Halfpenny, is brilliant, and I didn't have any input, I have to say, in choosing any of them. But I thought, she was brilliant, and her husband was good. And in the book, he's kind of like a big husky Irishman, because my wife, I think she likes big husky Irishmen. I don't know, but and so I put him in for her benefit, and I thought Owen MacDonald was really good, and they tinkered with the story a bit and the ending a bit, but it was good to see.
So, Wilf,
Thank you.
all these things you must be hoping for. Aren't we all as writers?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic sort of stories. I think that from my point of view, it all started very sort of like the first, just as you were sort of saying, the first book, it's not publishable because it tends to be it tends to be you're working through your own stuff, and you sort of like, you get this like, oh, brilliant, but it's all very sort of it's not particularly objectively written, if you like. So that was my first book was probably just around. In fact, I think it was the first one that I did, which was when print on demand just started coming out, and I sort of like thought, okay, I'm going to do another book now that's better, and then that was the one that was Lost Angels, and it was better, but it still not quite good enough. So I sold quite a few copies of that actually to begin with, but then I took it off my lists, if you like, because I was like, actually, I want to write something better. And then from then on, I wrote The Assassin's Wedding and then more, and then I'm quite happy with all those. They can stay on, but yeah, you definitely get better as you go along, I guess.
Do you get tempted to go back to the original book that you've jettisoned?
Yes. And I did get tempted to go back to it, and I learned very quickly that was a bad idea because it just wasn't going to work. I really wanted to I could do a good version of this now, and it's like, no. Because the problem is, of course, as you change, as you sort of go through time, you change as a person, and the world around you changes, and that's where the stories come from, like kind of like that combination of you and everything else around you. So then you can't write that story again. It's gone. Just get over it. So I've left it. Just as an old story.
So where do you get your inspiration for? I mean, as I said, The Assassin's Wedding. You haven't dealt with many assassins, have you?
That I know of, again.
But there are a few in the book, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's like everyone else has been saying. You kind of everything's just always whizzing around all the time, isn't it? Things that happen, you sort of just going through life. You don't even necessarily think at the time. I mean, sometimes you do, as you were saying, sometimes you do sort of say, oh, that would make a good idea. But quite a lot of the time, it just kind of like, it's not until later on when you're doing the washing up or something, and oh, actually, that's and then, so yeah, that one was, was heavily sort of influenced by sort of my getting married in the early years of being married, and sort of, you say that, and if anybody does read it, I just have to say that it's not sort of like, you kind of get, you get influenced by certain concepts that go into the story, but not necessarily all the events. All the events and characters are not, what did they say, names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Yes.
Protect the guilty.
Yeah. But yeah, no, because that one was because the character, he's as an assassin, he's very sort of like, never lets anyone know. That's obviously, you don't tend to tell people that's what you do. So when he meets this woman that he falls in love with, it's kind of like, oh, okay, this kind of goes against my, I don't form emotional attachments to people, but now I am doing, and it's like, okay, so I really should tell her that I'm an assassin, and it's kind of like, but I don't think that will go down very well.
It's not a profession, is it? Like, what's your job? I'm an assassin. For goodness sake.
I get paid to kill people every other month. So it's kind of like, so yeah, the book is the week of the wedding basically, and
Right.
he kind of like, he's from America, but he comes to England where she's from, in fact, where he's originally from as well, and it's set in Nottingham, because I just like the idea of setting things around where you live and stuff, especially if it's something, like a bit of because it's a bit of an action, a bit of a romance, a bit of a comedy. Yeah. So it's set, in fact, they get married in the church that I got married in, etc., etc. So it's all sort of.
Which church did you get married?
It was St Mary's in Bilsthorpe in north of Nottingham. North of Nottingham. So yeah, and it's very sort of. You kind of like just pick up all the bits and pieces as you're going along. You don't realise it until you sit down to start writing.
When did you start writing then?
I guess, well, it was actually when I was quite small, because I used to have my little Star Wars figures, and I'd set them up, and then and I'd write stories about them, and so I just had lots of random bits of paper all over the place, just littering the house, and eventually I thought I'd like to write a book, and I didn't write an actual book for many years, because obviously the stories got longer and longer and longer, but eventually, you got to, so like I say, Lost Angels, as I sort of counted my first book, that was, I guess that was like 99 or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then, but yeah, Assassin's Wedding was like 2006 or something like that. So yeah, so it's kind of like, that's where I sort of consider the beginning of the actual book writing.
And you ended up self-publishing?
Yeah, so...
I mean, I'll say this because I ended up self-publishing.
Yeah.
The frustrations are terrible. None of you are self-published, are you?
It's very
lucky.
It's basically when it was one of these things where I think it was a timing thing. So when I did Lost Angels, I think I did send that off to a few places, but like I say, it was not. I mean, I say it wasn't very good. The story was actually really good, but the way it was written was very, technically speaking, it was using 10 words when you could have used one, all those kind of things. So it was, didn't get very far in the sort of agent seeking process. And when I wrote The Assassin's Wedding, I was intending to sort of send that around to agents. But then, like I say, print on demand had sort of started happening, and the self-publishing thing was kind of taken off a lot more. It was a lot easier to do it. And so I sort of started doing that. And of course, that could have gone quite badly, because it would be quite easy to get into a bit of a bubble of, I'm doing these now, and actually writing things that's not that great, because you haven't really got that professional, you don't have editors and all those kind of things. So I just wanted to be really meticulous and, sort of like paid for, for an editor and to go over it. And I do my own covers, because I can do sort of drawing and design and that kind of thing. So, but again, it's not like, you study lots of books just to try and make sure it's as professional looking as possible, because the last thing you want to do is sort of just put something on that looks very sort of amateurish. So
you've got to get people to look at a cover and say, pick
you
it up.
literally do judge books by their covers.
That's how initial sales, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the cover, the title, cover, blurb, front page, random page.
And you're written for children?
Yeah, so after The Assassin's Wedding, I think my kids, who were around, I don't know, it must have been around 7 or 8 at the time, my eldest anyway, and she was like, why don't you ever write anything that we could read? So I was like, okay, yeah, I should do, really. So I was intending to write one book for children, and as you said, it wasn't really easy. It wasn't easy at all. I ended up sort of getting, going to a bit of a deep dive and reading lots of sort of books, which was really good to go back to reading books, younger kids' books again. And obviously around that time, I think Harry Potter was getting big, so there were a lot of books that were kind of aimed at children, but were still very consumable by adults as well. And so this one book that I was going to write turned into a series, which I am almost finished. Like sort of 10 years later. I've got literally 2 books left of the series to go. But so that was the Arelon Chronicles, and that was kind of like sort of set during World War II, but it's kind of mainly sort of takes place in sort of fantasy world. But yeah, that one was purely because the kids wanted me to write something for them. So yeah, that's where that came from.
Are you all prepared to do a reading?
I should have known something was wrong. I should have sensed it, felt it in the air like the build-up of pressure before a thunderstorm. That heavy, loaded calm. I was his father, after all, his first line of defence, and his last. But at this moment, at a few minutes past 3 o'clock in the morning, all I know is that I'm awake. Maybe it was a noise outside that pulled me from sleep, the call of a fox, or maybe a cat, something else. But all is silent now in the warm, inky blackness of the bedroom, both windows open, half the thin summer duvet thrown off. My phone is on silent on the bedside table. The screen's glow dazzling me for a moment as I look for a message from my son. The first of our 3 golden rules. 1, send a message to let us know where you are. Closely followed by 2, stick to your curfew. And thirdly, stay with your friends. We don't tell Connor not to drink because telling your teenager that seems like an exercise in futility. It's going to happen whatever we say, so we might as well just learn to live with it in a way that keeps him safe. There is no message from my son. But, to be fair, he's more likely to text my wife. She sleeps soundly beside me, her soft breathing a slow, comforting rhythm in the dark. It's a normal Saturday night. Curfew will be 11 p.m, but the first post-exams weekend of his summer holidays allows for a little more flexibility. He will have been back for hours by now, I think. And then that's it. I can't get back to sleep. My mind is starting up, gears turning, thoughts pulling me up and away, after images from the phone's screen still bright in my eyes. And for some reason, I need the bathroom. I swing my legs out of bed and pad across the landing. On my way back, I realise there's more light than there should be. A single bulb throwing a wash of pale shadows in the hall downstairs. The porch light is still on. Connor was supposed to turn it off when he came in. That was what we always said to him. The porch light switched off means we know you're home, okay? The light being left on means probably nothing. He just forgot, that's all. 16-year-olds forget things like that. I moved downstairs into the hall, the tiles cooled beneath my bare feet, and hit the light switch. Back on the landing, I go to the bottom of the small curving staircase that leads to his bedroom on the second floor, listening. The house is silent around me. He just left the porch light on, that's all. He leaves lights on all the time, and doors unlocked, and plates unwashed, toilet rolls bare, and wet towels on his bedroom floor. That's just what teenagers do. But I'm awake now. Might as well double check that he is home. I climb the top staircase. His door is ajar, and I push it open cautiously, taking a step inside, greeted by the familiar smells of summer sweat and trainers and deodorant lingering somewhere beneath. I squint into the shadows of his room, wishing I hadn't left my glasses on the bedside table, but I can still make out his familiar shape, long limbs sprawled beneath the duvet, dark hair against the pillow. No longer a boy, but not yet a man either. My whole body relaxes with relief. Connor is in bed, home, safe. Of course he is. I'm struck by a pang of nostalgia for the years when I'd read him bedtime stories every night, when he'd been my little shadow. We had been inseparable. But now he prefers to spend time with his cousin, with his mates, and he mostly confides in his mum. Probably because she's less judgmental. She sees his side and doesn't condemn. She doesn't necessarily condone either, but she listens without jumping in as I'm prone to do. Now I feel I'm always on his back, and increasingly we're like ships passing in the night, sometimes going for days at a time without exchanging more than a few words. But at 3:09 on a Sunday morning, none of that matters, because my boy is home. He's in his room, in his bed, where he's supposed to be. Everything is okay. I linger in the doorway, squinting into the shadows at my son's sleeping form, unaware in that moment of how badly mistaken I am. Because I should have known that something was wrong. I should have sensed it, but I didn't. Not until it was already too late.
I thought I'd read you a little bit from this one because it's set, even though it's not my most recent book, it came out a few years ago now, it's set in Nottingham, and I wrote it because I'm not from Nottingham originally, and I wanted to find out a bit more about the city, and I discovered that there was a real life war artist called Laura Knight who was brought up in Nottingham, and although she didn't come back to Nottingham during the war, she did go to other cities and paint the girls in the factories. And I thought, well, what if she'd come back to Nottingham, where she grew up, and painted in the big, because there was a big armament factory here in what's now NG2. What if she came back there, and what if that brought up things from her past? And so I'll just read you the prologue, which sort of sets the scene. She groped unseeing until her fingers connected with something soft. "I've got you," she said, tugging at the cloth, but there was no answer from the lumpen mass of overall covered limbs. Her eyes were streaming, the smoke hot acrid in her nostrils. Coughs razored up her parched throat. The sight of the fire was further in. Through squinted lashes, she could make out the orange glow at ground level. If the flames reached the gas cylinders, they'd be done for. But the flames hadn't reached the gas cylinders, not yet, and there was still a chance she could pull the woman to safety. She wedged her clog against the edge of a lathe base for leverage and heaved at the sleeve cuff she held. The body shifted an inch or two but didn't pull free. She yanked, harder this time, but the body was heavy as a wet sandbag, caught on something. If only she could see, but the smoke was hot thick. She slid down onto the concrete floor. She'd have to feel her way. She could hear sirens and shouts calling her away, but the sounds were muffled as birdsong beyond a window pane as she focused on her task. She crouched low, feeling her way down the length of the overall strap, waist button, side pocket, trouser leg, nudging and shoving at the inert form as she went, all the way down. Here it was, a foot caught up in one of the twirling gas hoses. Her fingers twisted the looping rubber, unhooking it from the woman's foot, tugging her leg free. At last. The boiling air was quicksand, pooling and sucking and swallowing them up. She had to get them both out fast. She had to get them down to the shelter in case the fire spread and the whole thing blew. She shuffled back, following the line of the overalls with her fingertips. She grabbed at the shoulder straps and pushed her foot against the lathe. She strained and wrenched, the cloth cutting into her palms. This time the body moved, and she followed the momentum, jerking and tugging and pulling it out along the factory floor away from the flames. Her breath came in grunting gasps, painful as the heat seared her lungs. There was sweat and tears in her eyes and a metallic taste in her mouth. The woman's head jolted awkwardly over the concrete floor, but there was no time to take care. There was no time. Suddenly there were hands at her shoulders, shouting voices, and the woman's body was pulled away, backwards towards the shelter door. "We've got her, now get inside for God's sake." "No, wait." She saw the easel, the canvas pale against the orange grey of the growing fire. The painting was so close to completion, those butter-smooth faces that had taken weeks to create. She broke free of the hands that grabbed her. It will only take a second to get the painting. She turned and ran back towards the flames.
Has anyone in the audience ever been in detention when they were at school? Please raise your hands. John? Oh, well, we are in good company. A lot of bad boys and girls here tonight. Well, you might be able to sympathise with my hero Zeke, who is in detention on Mars, and he's in the school secretary's office. Zeke felt as if his eyes were about to pop. He sneaked a glimpse of his watch. Only 9 o'clock. "Miss, can I finish? My wrist is killing me." The school secretary glared at him with the compassion of a hangman. Principal Lutz was quite specific. 10 copies of the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. You, I see, have only done 8. Zeke sighed. His fingers were throbbing, but he knew it was useless to beg for mercy. Marjorie Barnside, the school secretary, had a heart of steel. Every student in the chasm said so. "Where you're up to?" Zeke skimmed down the electro book. "Like one that on a lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread." "Ah, yes," said the secretary, "and having once turned round walks on, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread." Zeke raised his eyebrows. "Ah, I have a photographic memory, and it's the principal's favourite for detentions. Over the years, an awful lot of bad boys and girls have been at this institution." Zeke bowed his head and resumed copywriting. "Ah, are you making that noise?" the secretary asked. He stared at her vacantly. "Listen," she said. At first there was nothing. Then Zeke heard it too. A whooshing sound, distant but coming closer. "Miss, lock the door. Call for help." "Don't be a wee bairn. Concentrate on your lines." She stomped over to the open door and peered down the gloomy staircase. "Nobody, yet I hear something curious." Zeke leapt to his feet. Panic was bubbling through his ribcage. He knew exactly what was approaching. "Lock the door!" The photon lamps flickered and died. "My goodness, what in the devil's name goes there? Come away from the door!" The dust devil was marching up around the steps, a spinning cloud of sand with the luminous figure at its core. The secretary remained resolutely in the doorway. The monster reached the top, silhouetting her figure in its glow. She raised a hand in defiance. "Whatever you are, I deny you access. This student is my responsibility, and I am authorized by the office of the Chasm School to use force in his protection." The creature made a noise like laughter. It embraced her in its swirling chaos. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the stony-faced Barnside lifted off the ground and began rotating. Zeke watched helplessly as she gathered speed. Then the dust devil released her. The secretary flew through the air and crashed into the wall, collapsing in a shower of sparks. Wires burst from her ruptured shoulder. Her limbs jerked and her lips twitched. Then, with a puff of smoke, her body came to a complete stop. "She's an android?" Zeke cried. But there was no time to take it in. The dust devil was already moving into the room. "Escape!" screamed Zeke's inner voice. But how? The head of the dust devil swiveled on its shifting neck. Though it had no eyes, it was clearly searching for him. The terror was too much. "Get me out of here!" For a split second, he seemed to be at the bottom of a deep sea. Then, inexplicably, he was outside, on the landing. There was no time to waste. He hurtled down the stairs. "Don't slip," he cried. Never had the stairwell seemed so endless. His shadow ran before him, cast by the light of the demon at his heels. Reaching the bottom, he tore down the corridor. The dust devil was advancing incredibly fast despite its leisurely strides. It grabbed him by the hand. Cold, stinging sand blasted Zeke's skin. His foothold gave way and he tumbled onto the polished stone. Frantically, he scrambled back from the monster, staring at its empty face. "Stop!" he hollered with all his strength. The monster ignored him, reaching down again. Think, screamed the voice, and Zeke said, Mundfax. The dust devil froze. Mundfax, Zeke said again, just to be sure. Yes, the creature understood Martian, the word that meant stop in that language. Fired by adrenaline, Zeke dredged the vocabulary he needed from his subconscious. Who are you? He said in the alien language. The dust devil stirred. A slit of a mouth opened and a tongue of dry sand coughed out primeval syllables. New master calls me Caliban. New master? That had to be the professor. Well, what are you? Something forgotten. Zeke's mind flashed back to that Martian text the professor was so determined to translate. What is the infinity trap? The living twister groaned. A secret.
Yes, this is from A Marriage of Lions, which is my most recent paperback at the moment. And it's about a lady called Joanna de Montchesney, who was granddaughter of the great William Marshall. She was raised at the royal court, and she's a junior lady in the household of the Queen. She's got a brother called John, and her uncle is the Earl of Pembroke, and he's given her a new pony to ride. And she's gone to the stables to see her new pony with her brother John. She's about 10 years old, and the dog that they've been sent to walk, who's called Sausages, which is sausages in Anglo no French. Right. Her new mount was from her uncle's estate at Goodrich on the Welsh borders, and his name was Ariane, which meant silver in the Welsh tongue. She had ridden him for the first time today, and he had been swift to respond to her voice and her touch on the reins. She could scarcely believe her good fortune. He's a beauty, John said with reluctant admiration, leaning against the stable door, arms folded. Sausages snuffled around in the straw, hunting for rodents. Yes, he is. Brimming with happiness, Joanna patted Ariane's warm dappled neck. The last rays of evening sunlight tinted the trees beyond the palisade with burned gold. A man led a donkey toward the kitchens, 2 side panniers mounded with chestnuts from the woods. Of course, he's far too small for me, John said condescendingly. Uncle Gilbert lets me help with the destriers. It wasn't strictly true. He was allowed to polish the harness and mix the feed, but the head groom and the older squires saw to all the close work on the big stallions. A fanfare announced the arrival of visitors, and moments later horses came pounding into the yard, their hides steaming and streaked with sweat. There were sergeants and knights, squires and heralds, one bearing a banner blazoned with a fork-tailed lion on a crimson ground. Simon de Montfort back from Rome, John said knowledgeably. His harbingers brought the news to the king this morning. Joanna eyed the men on their big stamping horses with trepidation. Their open mouths and laughter, the boldness and colour, vivid in the burnished light. She had heard several tales in the Bower about the clandestine marriage between the king's sister Eleanor and the French knight Simon de Montfort. The marriage had happened shortly before she came to court. Her uncle Gilbert's brother William had been Eleanor's first husband. After he died, suddenly the Lady Eleanor had taken a vow of chastity, but had broken that vow for love of de Montfort. They had conducted a clandestine courtship, discreet but not discreet enough, and rumours abounded that they had shared a bed out of wedlock. The king had agreed to let them marry, and their hasty secret wedding had taken place in his private chapel at Westminster. Almost immediately, that secret had come undone, and when the news broke in public, the scandal and upheaval had been enormous. Eleanor had retired to Kenilworth to await the birth of the child so swiftly conceived that many whispered she had already been pregnant on her wedding day. Simon de Montfort had journeyed to Rome to obtain a papal dispensation for the match, amid much cynical grumbling about bolting the stable door after the horse had gone, and remarks louder than whispers about newcomers shouldering their way up the ranks through dishonourable and ribald behaviour. The king's brother Richard and Joanna's uncle Gilbert had protested furiously because of the implications to their own families and status, and although peace had been made, it was fragile. She had overheard her Uncle Gilbert grimly telling one of his lawyers that if de Montfort thought to pursue claims to his new wife's rights from her former marriage, he would be sadly disappointed, for he would not receive a single penny. Joanna called Sosagaze to her side and leashed him, deciding it was time she returned to the Queen. John watched the dismounting men, admiring their equipment, but stiff with tension. Joanna took his arm. "Will you escort me back to the Queen?" His irritated look was superficial, and she saw the relief in his eyes. "Very well, but only 'cause you're my sister and you need protecting. Don't think I'm your servant." Joanna curbed the retort that Cecily said all men should serve ladies courteously. She gave Ariane a final pat and left the stable, John at her side, and Sosagaze dragging on his leash. De Montfort, wearing a fine fur-lined cloak, reined his pawing sorrel stallion across their path, amusement brightening the hard planes of his face. "What have we here?" he asked. "Are you both not a little young to be attending a tryst?" Joanna's cheeks flamed. Sosagaze bared his teeth and began a shrill yapping that caused the horse to put back its ears. "I'm escorting my sister to the Queen," John said stoutly, although his voice wavered. "Your sister?" De Montfort looked him up and down. "Remind me who you are." "John de Monchensi, son of Warren de Monchensi of Swanscombe, sire," John said, jutting his chin. De Montfort's smile lost some of its humour. "A marshal by maternity," he said. "Well, your mother's family came from the stables, I suppose." He looked round at his companions and laughed, and then pressed his heels into his mount's sides. The horse surged toward Joanna, hooves dancing. She sprang backwards, feeling sick, and scooped the hysterical Sosagaze into her arms. John stepped in front of them, his body a rigid shield. De Montfort smiled and pranced closer again. The palfrey's hot breath gusted, and the shod hooves flashed. Joanna whimpered. De Montfort made a contemptuous sound and pulled the big chestnut back. "What a fine little hedge knight you are, John of Swanscombe," he said. "Begone to your nursemaids. I do not make war on milksops and mongrels." Abruptly he reined the horse away and clopped across the courtyard to his waiting groom. Joanna blinked, determined not to cry. John wrapped his hands round his belt. "Don't worry, de Montfort won't be staying long." "How do you know?" "Because his wife is great with child. He'll be going to Kenilworth for the birth as soon as he's reported to the king." Joanna shuddered. The dying blood-red light in the west, the steaming horses, and the raw masculine power seemed like a weight dropping across her shoulders, heavy with threat. "He doesn't frighten me," John said. She didn't believe him. She had been terrified, and he was no braver than she was.
Are there any questions you'd like to have? Jeremy over there.
Well, it's good to see Tim again.
You too.
I was just wondering, as you spent years working to a discipline of economy of expression, always looking for a shorter way of saying things, and also doing it to a deadline. I just wonder whether those disciplines are a help or a hindrance as you embark on real writing.
Well, I think certainly for writing thrillers, which is my only experience really of fiction, that I think it certainly has been a help. And like you say, expressing yourself in the briefest terms possible. And I remember one of my when I trained at Cardiff, one of my lecturers, one of my tutors there said, if you write a sentence or a paragraph this is when I was training to be a journalist, and you write a sentence and the reader doesn't understand it. Straight away, that's not their fault; it's your fault, and that was always that kind of something that stuck with me, and stuck with me, in the books as well. And they go through lots of editing to make it as clear as possible, especially when you've got scenes which are complicated, lots of people, lots of characters, lots of dialogue. Always trying to make sure that I'm thinking about the reader, and I think as journalists, you're always thinking about the reader first as well. So I think that certainly did transfer, and then the working to deadlines as well is obviously been it's kind of a useful discipline to have, and to sort of to learn, and to know that when you have the blank page in the morning, you know not to be sort of intimidated by it, and to know that you can fill it. And
you're a morning person as far as writing is concerned.
yeah, I mean, I tend to do work best in the morning, and afternoons I generally use for sort of more admin and emails and other stuff. But certainly the best writing for me has always been in the morning. I'm always sort of fresher, and my brain is kind of seems to be a bit more, alert.
I'd be interested to know if, John, your other guests have a regime for writing. Are they morning people as well? Or
It's a good question.
I definitely am. I'm not a morning person, but when I'm writing, that's the best time for me to do it, because the evenings, after work, working on computers all day, my brain is just like a bit of mush. So, yeah, mornings. And it's interesting when you mentioned about deadlines, because like I'm a massive procrastinator as well. So deadlines are my friend, because without deadlines, I get nothing done at all. Like most of my Aralon books are actually published in June. Why? Because the Newark Book Festival is in July, and that's when I always try and make sure I've got the latest part, because I know people are going to be asking about it. So yeah, mornings for me definitely.
Elizabeth, no? Claire? Okay, yeah.
No, pass it.
Yeah, okay.
I'm an afternoon person, so it does vary. I find I tend to do a lot of admin and the social media things in the morning. And I find that I don't actually come online with the creativity till about 3 o'clock. And then between 3 o'clock and, say, quite late evening, 8 o'clock, with a break for my evening meal, things go a lot faster. So, different stroke to different folks.
How about you, Claire?
Well, it varies, but I think it depends what I'm doing, because I write longhand and then I type up afterwards. And when I'm writing the longhand bits, it comes best if I've just woken up. But occasionally I will just have a little nap in the afternoon so that I can write when I've just woken up, because it's just a bit freer then. But yeah, I suppose more mornings. And I've got into the habit now. There's I don't know if any of you do the London Writers Salon. They do these like worldwide Zoom calls 4 times a day. It's 8 a.m. UK time, 8 a.m. Eastern Seaboard time, and anyway, so it's in our terms it goes sort of 8, 1, 4 and 9 or something. But then that means I get to the desk at 8 o'clock and I have to be writing at 8 o'clock, because I'm on a Zoom call with hundreds of other people who are also writing at 8 o'clock, and there's a degree of accountability there, and that makes you get on with it, which is quite good. Yeah.
Ian, finally. Yeah.
Well, I must be a bit of a writing tart, because I can write at any time. Morning, afternoon or evening, whenever there's a spare moment, I did a bit of journalism before I became published in fiction when I was living overseas, so I identified with what Tim said. I wrote for magazines and newspapers in Thailand, and that was a tremendous, working for a deadline and learning to be economic. I think it's great training for a writer.
Yeah.
So.
Not so easy to cut down sometimes to Pracy, is it? Well, because it's your own stuff. But anyway, any questions? Any more questions?
I've got one that can go for everyone.
Go on.
Has there ever been a time that you've written something that you didn't know you were going to write, like a scene or a chapter that until you were in the moment writing it, you had no idea was going to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and very often that's the subconscious working on you, isn't it? And sometimes those can be your best moments of writing, because though it's unplanned, it's something you feel strongly about, and so the words come better.
I think for me, not necessarily on the day. So when I get up in the morning and I sit down and I think, well, I want to write whatever my 1,200 words today, and I think it's going to be this. But I think certainly if you go a longer time frame, when I'm starting to think about a story, then certainly then there are lots of things or endings or twists that I can only really think of as I'm going along. So kind of a bit of a mix really. But because I want to try and be productive every day, I'm always trying to have an idea when I'm literally often when I get out of bed, putting the kettle on, what is it going to be today? What's the first thing? What's the so yeah, I'm probably a bit boring in that respect, and not so much spontaneous, but more kind of it's always going on up here. So
Cool. Will.
Yeah, well, I always try and plan everything out before I actually write it. So I just sort of think, that's going to be my story, and then I sort of sit down and actually start writing the chapters, and then occasionally the story's kind of like. That's not going to happen. You're going to have to go away and rethink this. And I'm like, well, no, because that's what I planned out. And then, like at the end of the assassin's wedding, I got to a point and I actually couldn't carry on, and I didn't realise why I was stuck. And then I realised it was because the story was basically saying to me, no, that's not going to happen to this character. This is going to happen to the character. I was like, oh right, okay, that's kind of really disappointing, but okay, that's kind of. And then it actually made for a better ending. And so yeah, sometimes it does happen, and it is actually really, really good, because then you realise that, oh, actually that the story is actually working better than I thought it was going to.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, if I was writing to deadline, then obviously you have to have a plan, and you've got to get to your word count, because you've got to. But I did have one. The second book I wrote, I had a character who was just there in a scene, and I wasn't expecting him to become a character, but he sort of insinuated himself in and took over, and ended up having about 20% of the book from his point of view, and he was based on another's one who's based on a real person, and I think that's what he would have done in real life. He was one of those people who just kind of muscled their way in, and he muscled his way into my fiction in the same way as he would have muscled his way in real life. So it has happened, yeah.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I always plan my novels out now in detail, but I still don't know what the journey is going to be. And a lot of the time, especially with that first draft, it's like I chuck all the information to my subconscious, and I really don't know. I have to wait for them to chuck back what's going to come out. In my earlier career, I didn't write so much to plan, but I had one character who I thought I was going to kill off, and he refused to die. And he had to be seriously injured, but it was like, no, I'm not dying. So he ended up finishing the novel with a wooden leg. Which I didn't know until I came to write his death scene, and then it was like, no, you're not. So yes, it happens. I would say all the time. I told my agent all about this once, and she said, I would say if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and that's good advice.
Yeah, okay. Any more questions? We're going to take a refreshment break, and then of course these good people would like to sign copies of their books, because Christmas is coming up, and they'll make ideal Christmas presents. So you think that doesn't appeal to me, but it does appeal to artists, or young Tim.
And old Tim.
And old Tim. So we'll have a break, yeah? Thank you very much. Thank you, our authors.